Welcome back, everyone. I'm here with Kevin Andrew Murphy, a horror, science fiction, and fantasy author. Welcome, Kevin. How are you doing today?
Oh, pretty good. It's a nice day.
Yeah, it's pretty nice here too. Actually, it's a beautiful day outside. Although in my infinite wisdom, I scheduled like three Zoom calls, so which is fine. Which is fine.
Oh well.
Um, I enjoy doing this. It's just every once in a while I kind of look wistfully outside. So, for those who are unfamiliar with your work and your background, could you just tell us a little bit about where you're from, and just kind of a brief bio or background about who you are and how you got into the writing business.
Okay. Well, I'm from San Jose originally, pretty much born and raised in Silicon Valley. Other than a little bit of did college at UC Santa Cruz and grad school down at USC in LA. But other than that, lived my entire life in California, in Silicon Valley and down in Almaden, until moving to Reno 2 years ago, and just at the start of the pandemic. And I've now got my lair set up here with all of my books, and still unpacking. But you know, not much has happened with the pandemic other than doing a lot of writing and a lot of unpacking on my end. I'm sort of just getting to finally go out and explore a little bit of Reno. But
You also don't have any more state income taxes, so that's
well, yeah,
bonus too.
there is that too. And actually, I lived in Truckee for a while, for half the years. My mom had a ski cabin there, and so I'm used to the snow country, and I go skiing, and I'm probably going to go skiing in a couple days from now. Season passes are very useful that way.
Is there
Um,
still a lot of snow? Is there still snow on the ground up there?
oh yeah, there's tons. I can look out my back window and I can see snow on the hills. We got snow about a couple of weeks ago, and, so it's even still here around in Reno.
All right. Anyway, going back to you. Instead of,
Yeah,
I'm jealous. I'm jealous of the snow. I grew up on the East Coast, so I miss all the fun stuff of snow, and I conveniently forget all the painful things of the snow, like
yeah.
shoveling the sidewalk.
Last year we had a weird record snowfall, and since I live in a little private canyon here with a road about 2 blocks long, I had to pay $500 to plow myself out because the snow was so high. You basically just went sledding down the hill in your car if you went out the door. If you could actually, and people couldn't get up, so it was a case where I was seriously snowed in. But that was also a weird 10-year storm that you don't usually get in Reno, but we're having weird weather lately. But anyway, back to career. So, writing wise, what people have seen of me is I think my very first professional publication was in Dragon magazine, writing an article on wishes for D&D. They gave me the
Hmm.
nice center spread, and then that was the same time as in grad school, and I got a gig to write for wild cards for their gaming end, and I did Aces Abroad, which was an adaptation of the Aces Abroad anthology. I'll get back to you later, as an adventure. And then George R.R. Martin had read it for approval, and then ended up deciding that he liked my characters, wanted to play with them, and so jumped me into the gang. And it was a couple years. Well, it was a couple years later that I finally got to write for them. I was 26, but my characters Hearn and Cameo got pulled into the universe before then, and John Joseph Miller and Steve Lay and some of the other people, and of course also George, were writing them for Dealer's Choice. Actually, that got reissued a couple years ago with Hearn right there on the cover again. So I've got like the great cover artwork. Need to get a copy of that and put that up on my walls. But anyway, so I did the GURPS game book, which then led me into getting for wild cards, and then I also had been writing gaming stuff for Stuart Wick at White Wolf when it was a magazine, but then it became a publisher, and they did Vampire the Masquerade, and I approached him saying, would you like someone to put an anthology together for you? And he said, well, we're already doing that. Would you like to write a story for it? So I wrote a story for that, and then wrote stories for Mage and created my character Penny Dreadful, who became incredibly popular. And I even got to write a novel for her after several short stories. And so that came out like 25 years ago, and they just reissued her a couple of years ago for the Mage 20th anniversary Kickstarter, and had me as a $500,000 stretch goal to have my novel reissued, which was very nice.
Wow.
Yeah, it says I would like to have some of that money, but that's the trouble with the licensing bit. But Wildcards has been much nicer to me for licensing money because, of course, George has wrangled the contracts very well, where everybody owns things together, and so we've gotten money from Disney and Universal Cable Pictures and various other things. Actually, Wildcards is in development right now for the Peacock channel.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so crossing my fingers on that, and I've got a graphic novel for Wildcards called Anti-Up that'll be coming out from Random House, whichever label they put on their graphic novels. But it's basically dealing with Random House, who's George's publisher for all the Game of Thrones stuff.
So for the uninitiated, Wildcards is a shared universe created by it's created by George R.R. Martin, though, right?
Yeah, created by George R.R. Martin and Melinda Snodgrass together. And basically, I'll go ahead and give the origin there. It's like everybody is a gamer. It was George and Melinda and John Joseph Miller and Vic Milan and I think Gail Gerstner Miller. Basically, they were the original. Oh, and Walter John Williams were the original crew of gamers in Albuquerque and Santa Fe who were running Superworld, which was created by Steve Perrin, who's another friend of mine who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, who also got put into Wildcards and just had his first story come out for Wildcards in Joker Moon last year. Good that he actually got to finally have a story in the anthology. It's so sad that he died. But long story short is that it was a world with superheroes, but George and Melinda, actually it was Melinda, came up with the brilliant idea of a sort of a unified theory of how we have all of these people with all of these different powers, and it's basically the wild card virus, which is this virus that was created by these aliens called the Tahitians, and it's made to amplify psychic powers, but of course it really deals with the subconscious and weird things in people's biology. So unfortunately, it's not a very well-made virus because 9 times out of 10, it will kill you. Anything from dropping dead to turning into a 30-foot tall, 3-headed green pig and collapsing of your own mass, in which case you're still dead, but, there's a whole gamut. Usually we don't have the incredibly strange, mutations, but it's a possibility. And then there's, and the 1% chance that you survive it, well, 9 times out of 10, you get deformed in some ways, like you're turned into a pig, you have 3 heads, you are green, whatever, or all 3 at the same time, or something else strange. And that's bad, and people like that are called jokers. And then the 1% who get a useful superpower are called aces. And then there's a few other things where if you've got a superpower, but it's really stupid, like, I can shoot laser beams out of my eyes. They're not very powerful laser beams. I can amuse my cat and maybe use it for, PowerPoint. But it's just like having a couple of little keychain lasers stuck in my eyes. That's, it's like, oh, I'm really scared. That's not going to, going to do anything other than, amuse your cat. So that's called a deuce because, like, well, it's an ace, but no, it's really kind of stupid. And then there are also, we've put in the, recently I got to write the opening story of Knaves Over Queens, which is our first British volume, and I introduced the concept of knaves, which actually goes back to the beginning of Wildcards in their British line, where a knave is somebody who is a joker but with superpowers, like my character Hearn. He's like 8 foot tall and has antlers and stag legs, but he can also blow a horn and summon the wild hunt, and he's super strong and can throw a spear through battleship plates. So it's like, okay, he's weird and he's mutated, but he also looks like a romance cover novel for his human parts, and he's, ridiculously strong. So it's like, he's not a joker, he's not an ace, he's a knave. And we've also now started putting that into the American bit, where people have, for a while, we're calling them joker aces, but that was kind of clumsy. So the Americans are now finally calling them jacks. If you've got somebody who's, a joker ace, just joker ace, now it's a jack. And so there's that going on. And then I've got lots of characters. There's Hearn and Cameo, who I've written a Cameo story before, and then I've bounced around. I've had Slim Jim, who can get really thin. I had him in let's see, Low Ball. It was one of the new, actually, it was not Low Ball. That was the sequel. He was in Fort Freak, which is the part of our Fort Freak precinct, which is basically, Fort Freak is the police precinct where all of the Joker's mazes are in Manhattan, because we did do the comic bit to explain why everything was in the virus got dumped on Midtown Manhattan in 1946-47, and then went around the world from there. But that's why there's such a concentration of aces and jokers in New York. But then again,
why, if the virus was first broke out in Midtown Manhattan, why would more people survive in Midtown Manhattan?
Well, no, most people didn't survive. A huge number of people were killed. But the thing is that you get the virus can infect you, and then it sort of went into the jet stream. But also, we've set it up where is that if you have survived the virus and you're infected with it, you can pass it on to your children, and it's a recessive. And so if you're an ace, and your wife's a joker, and you have a kid, the kid will be a latent, but will have the wild card virus, but it can express anywhere from conception to birth to, it usually goes anytime there's like some stress going on in somebody's life. So, it's like, it's my 5th birthday party. Yay, I got a pony and now I'm dead. So, so
it's an interesting choice.
but you see, like, actually for the birthday party, I'll go ahead and mention one of my characters. My character Rosa Lotteria, who I've got the graphic novel Anti-Up is starring her. She's got a pack of Lotteria cards, which her grandmother gave her at her quinceanera. So, her 15th birthday, and she got the heirloom pack of Mexican lottery cards, which she shuffled, and she suddenly pulled out, El Nopal, the cactus, and turned into Cactus Girl. And that was like, oh God, you've got a joker. But then it turned out she figured out she could shuffle the deck and pull a new card. It's like, now I've turned into El Bota the Boot, and suddenly became like Nancy Sinatra with the 7 League Boots, and like walked, 3 steps and ended up in Van Nuys. She's from Los Angeles. I'm like, okay, well, that's cool. So she's got a really neat, power where she can basically pull random aces and jokers and jacks out of her deck, and turn into them or get a superpower. But it's a lot like Dial H for Hero. She never knows which superpower she's going to get, and sometimes it's like being Cactus Girl, where it's kind of useless.
Yeah, it's certainly a useless. Well, unless you like chase somebody and give them a big hug.
Yeah, it's like, okay, well, I've got pricky thorns and cactus blossoms for hair, but it's like, okay, I can throw a prickly pear at you. That's still not really, compared to somebody who can fly and shoot actual laser beams out of their eyes. This is really not anything to be afraid of.
Now, who would you say your writing influences are?
Okay, my writing influences. Well, uh, I let's see. I guess. Well, I've had a couple of writing mentors. So George R.R. is one. Catherine Carr is another who writes the Jeffrey book. She's one of my oldest and best friends. But that's also a case of older writers who've taken me under their wing and taught me a lot. But then for writers who I've admired and tried to emulate, I mean, like everybody, I grew up reading Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and lots of other things. But I would say probably my biggest influence as a writer is Joan Aiken. And Joan Aiken, a wonderful British children's author, but also wrote adult books, writing very much in Jane Austen style. So roundabout, actually, I've had people reading my stuff. It's like, you write an awful lot like Jane Austen, but since she's the greatest stylist in the English language, this is not a bad thing. So, and Joan Aiken was a big time Jane Austen scholar, and so I certainly picked up a lot of the stylistic quirks from that. But I'm not going to complain about it. Is that people seem to like them, including George.
Makes sense. But is that your only influence, you would say, or are there others?
Let's see. John Bellairs, who wrote The House with the Clock on Its Walls, which was recently a movie. There's his love of little weird antiquarian things and mystery and horror. And the thing is that I write horror, but really what I write is very dark, quirky fantasy, which is something I would say that Bellairs is a big influence. And I'm trying to think of other ones. I really I love Meredith Ann Pierce's writing. Trisha McKillip adored The Forgotten Beasts of Eld and The Master of Head. So those were awesome influences. Here's Anthony, of course, for the some of the silly stuff, but also some world building. And there are different favorite authors I've had over time, but I was like, stylistic influences, Jane Austen by way of Joan Aiken, and other world building, lots of D&D stuff, but also a lot of the antiquarian stuff from John Bellairs gets gotten in.
Now, when you look at kind of current writers today, who do you enjoy reading?
Well, it's the awful thing about writing is it takes down so much of your reading time. So it's the case where it's like, who is it that I really enjoy writing? I was like, as I said, I'm friends with kids, so I try to keep up on Catherine Carr's latest novels, and a lot of the other wild cards writers. I read their things. I'm trying to think of other authors. I'm reading Scott Lynch right now, and I'm really enjoying his style and books. So I'm like, in the middle of the Gentleman Bastards series. So I'm enjoying that. Trying to think of who else. Then, of course, I just picked up one of Joan Aiken's original anthologies that had a few new short stories of hers that she put out before she died. So I'm sort of catching up on old favorites as well. So it's a question of, who's current. Well, a lot of people are still around and they're still writing. So there's not a lot of the very, very newest writers that I've been reading. But that's just simply because I've got a huge to-be-read pile and a lot of old favorites, luckily, most of whom are still publishing.
Now, if someone who's unfamiliar with your work were to start somewhere, what's the first book they should pick up by you?
Okay, first book by me. It depends on what you want. Penny Dreadful, the novel I did for White Wolf, is still in print, and while not getting royalties on that, people have really liked it, and there's a lot of fun, fun, quirky stuff in there. And it's, as someone had commented to me, one of the other authors that you for White Wolf said, I had not thought that anyone could write a comedy set in the world of darkness, and you did it. But that's what happens when you put a kind of perky goth girl who has read a whole bunch of fairy tales and then suddenly realizes that they're true, and is now suddenly dealing with ancient witches and vampires. And there's like the ancient witch Jodie Black, who is unfortunate, as Penny comment, it's like finding that she's like 700 years old and is still looking in her 20s. Like, well, someone's oil of Olay was certainly working well. And she later on is called offenders like, who do you think you're dealing with, girls? Like Bimbo Yaga, because she's Penny comment was on Jodie. It's like, it says, if I was a 700-year-old witch and still playing a sex kitten, I'd have some serious issues I was working through. But that's really, that character was actually created by Jim Moore, who's another well-known horror author. We were writing together back in the day. We got to do a braided story for Truth Until Paradox, the first Mage anthology. But she's very scary and old-fashioned, but she's also a classic trope. The old hag who turns herself young and beautiful, but you have a young feminist looking at that and going like, sister, you have issues. And so that was just a lot of fun to write, and people have enjoyed it since. So I'll say, go ahead, Penny Dreadful. That's of course, in the world of darkness. Now, if you want some of my fiction that is outside of the world of darkness, Esther Friesner did the Supernatural Suburbia trilogy, which starts with Which Way to the Mall, and I've got the story in there, Tacos for Tezcatlipoca, which is my first of my Bryce Pierpont stories, and he's sort of the accidental magician. And that's actually very easy to find because aside from Which Way to the Mall still being in print, Bain featured it on their website, and in the first, it's still up there because it was like one of the first 3 or 5 stories in the book, and they even used it for the book teaser, which was a nice compliment. So that's something you can get. And well, of course, as you know, you can get me in Sean Patrick Hazlett's Weird World War 3 and Weird World War 4. I've got 2 different stories in there, unrelated. Anastasias Egg and remind me of the title of my one from Weird World War 4. Portals of the Past, which is a science fiction meets magic time travel story.
And then tell a little bit more about Anastasias Egg. I've actually gotten lots of compliments about that story from readers in places that I wouldn't have expected. Like you're very popular in the corporate world.
The corporate world?
Yeah, I have a friend. I'm overinflating it, but I have a friend who it was his favorite story in the volume. I'm like, huh. He's like very different from you, but he really enjoyed it. So,
that's great. Yeah, Anastasia's Egg was my take on, going back to not Bimbo Yaga, but actually Baba Yaga. So we're doing the Baba Yaga stories, but actually my main protagonist is actually Baba Yaga's villain, Koche the Deathless, who has reinvented himself as a Russian spy, and then is having to deal with Vasilisa the Wise / the Beautiful, who's also known as the Frog Princess, who he had, made a rather forced arranged marriage with all those years ago before she outwitted him with Prince Ivan and got help from Baba and lots of help from Baba Yaga. So don't want to spoil too much there, but I will say that the opening scene is they get together in a cowboy and western bar in Moscow with a mechanical bull and and all you can eat sliders because it's the Muscovites version of this is what the Americans must have. It's the ridiculous rhinestone cowboy bar as done in Russia, which is like just the perfect place for the spies to meet up. And the whole story takes place there, but it gets progressively weirder as we're dealing with yet more and more Russian fairy tales and a little bit of the Arabian Nights.
Well, there's also an ode, not an ode, but it's also like a bit of a tribute to that Rasputin song by, what is it, Boney M?
Yes, yes, yes.
Which I had never heard of it until I read your story, and I'm like, this song is disturbingly good. I don't know why I like it, but it's good.
Yeah, that was that. Spoil another small thing is that Koche the Deathless, when he had reinvented himself, one of his reinventions was, to come by as being, Rasputin, because when you're a tall, brooding, dark wizard with strange powers, well, makes perfect sense.
Yeah, it just works. All right, and then there's your story in Weird World War IV, which felt like, and I don't know if this was your intention, but it was a like a love letter to San Francisco a little bit, in terms of the history and things like that. But yeah, say more about that without spoiling it. I enjoyed that aspect of it. There's a lot of, it's very rich with a lot of local history when it comes to that city.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that I'm a history buff, and so I went through all of these things that I know from San Francisco history, and there's the portals of the past, which were the basically the classic columns that were the front of some robber baron's mansion that got burned down during the earthquake and fire, but the marble pillars remained, and Arnold Ganthe, who was a famous photographer, took an amazing picture of like the smoking ruins of the city through these portals that were still standing, and it's like one of the great images. And then they did a painting of it that I think the Bohemian Club had, and then the city took down the portals and put them over into Golden Gate Park as a monument. And those are still there. But part of the story that I've got is I'm dealing with some time travel, and part of the rules of the time travel is that you need a touchstone of something that exists in the present that also exists in the past to pretty much navigate around. And then we'll start out in the future, and World War III has gone on, and it was a replicant uprising mixed with a robot uprising, and everything really bad happened to humanity. And we suddenly have Johnny Phoenix, who's this young kid who's like just really wants a girlfriend or a boyfriend, but he's a cyborg that his parents, put together out of the spare parts bin. And then he suddenly has this love at first sight. It's like, why am I seeing this girl and recognizing her? Because he's got nowhere in his, wetware memory banks or his computerized memory banks. He's like, why is she so familiar? And so it's the weird deja vu. And suddenly the mystery girl, won't spoil things, but there's like all sorts of San Francisco history and oddness that gets into there, and I get to have fun pretty much dealing with it. And I'll just say, the portals of the past are part of it, and we've got we start in the far future for World War IV, or basically World War IV for my story is a time war, and things get sidetracked and derailed.
On that note, what sort of what recent books should not writers, but fans check out that came out in the last few months that you would point people to, in addition to Weird World War III and Weird World War IV?
In the last few months, honestly,
or last year, whatever.
Yeah, last year. Oh God, it's like honestly, I'm going to say straight off admit that I've been behind on my reading and my writing because it's been a hell of a year for me. I lost my dad last summer, and my uncle, who's his younger brother, died just this last month. So I've been dealing with a lot of grief and a lot of, getting away from things, and I tend to not pick up the very most current book that's on the shelf. Is that what I've been going back for is books like Joan Aiken had the Serial Garden that came out a few years ago that has like 4 of her
Oh no, I'm not talking about books that you're reading. I'm talking about your books, things that
okay.
or anthologies that have your short stories in them that people should check out that came out recently.
Okay, yeah. Then, one of the things I've been writing for, there's a Kickstarter for S5E, which is a superhero game, and they have me writing their fiction, some of which is already out, and some of which I'm still writing. But there's a bunch of short stories there called the Union of Six, which is having a team of 6 superheroes, and then there's also there's the Union of Seven, which is a different different one, and I'm right now in the beginning, in the writing stages and getting everything with my editors there. But I'm really rather proud of it, and actually that is out also in audiobooks from it'll come to me in a second. The Sound Booth Theater. That's who's doing the dramatizations. And actually, on the Weird War, and a few years ago, I did for a different editor had the a Weird War anthology, and I got to do a Weird War I story that it deals with the photographing fairies, but it's called No Man's Land, and that came out in the Weird Wars anthology from Wendigo Tales, which is run by Savage Worlds, and that. However, Sound Booth Theater just did an audiobook of that, and they also did one for Necessary Evil, which is a superhero gaming world with the villains who actually had to step up. And so I've got the Tablets of Destiny that came out in that, but that just came out from Sound Booth Theater last year as well. And they did a really, really nice full dramatization, with sound effects and music and, multiple actors doing that. So I'm very pleased with how both of those came out as audiobooks.
Any, what was the latest wildcard book that you came out with?
Okay, latest wildcards that I'm in is the opening stories of Knaves Over Queens, which is a flint lies in the mud, but a flint holds fire, and that you'll find. It's my Captain Flint story, and that's actually a character who I created way back for the Aces Abroad game book, and he got brought in as an official character, and then I finally got to write his origin story on the Queen Mary, because it was one of the cool things that had been set up in the very first Wildcards book is that mentioned is that the Queen Mary was in the mid-Atlantic when the Wildcard spores came by and caused the Queen Mary disaster, where everybody got infected aboard the Queen Mary and it like barely limped into port. And I pointed out to George is that, well, Queen Mary, we have never had the Queen Mary anywhere mentioned in any of the New York stories, which is kind of odd if the Queen Mary is there. And, it probably would not have ended up in Long Beach as a hotel and restaurant like it is in our reality. So I said, well, we're going to finally get to, show London as more than a glimpse. So can I do the Queen Mary story and have it turn around in the mid-Atlantic to try to get away from the spore cloud, which doesn't work, but this is why they end up, docking it near the Canary Wharf, the Isle of Dogs, on the River Thames. And so we've got it, permanently put there. And I got to do the story of that. And then other authors have been using it since then. It has sort of become a hotel and nightclub after the disaster because, of course, this is where the London outbreak came from. But it gave us a Jokertown origin point for London.
Now, what sort of what are you working on now? What are some of your work in progress projects?
Okay, well, the work is already done for me, but it's with our artist John Sanchez is Anti Up, which is my Rosa Ladria graphic novel, and actually that's a collaboration with John Joseph Miller. As a few years ago when my mom had passed away, I hadn't been able to finish up the revisions in quite the right time. It wasn't the right frame of mind because part of the story is Rosa dealing with grief from the death of her grandmother, and it's like, okay, that's way too close to home. So John Joseph Miller took over the story and addressed the changes that need to be made and introduced some of his own characters for the third act troubles that I was having. Anyway, there's a great script, and it's actually, I think, going to be John's last publication. But right now, John Sanchez, our artist, is finishing up the inking for that. So whenever, everything has been derailed by the pandemic. So it was supposed to be out a couple of years ago, but life takes weird twists and turns. But it's right now, finishing up into the pipeline, and will hopefully be coming out. And cross my fingers for having Wildcards TV show come out from Peacock at some time. So a nice cross pollination. And then there's some other Wildcards books which I'm going to mumble about. But there are more Wildcards books in the pipeline, and I have one story in and accepted, and that's good. And there's another story I've got for a different book, which I just got revision notes from George yesterday. And for anybody who's wondering, it's just like George working on Westeros. George said, "It's like you've got some months. I need to go back to Westeros now and work on that." So yes, George is working on Westeros, but this is something we've been working on these books for like over the pandemic. I turned in my revisions for the first story like 2 years ago in December. So this is a case of we've been working on these stories for quite a bit of time. But there are more Wildcards anthologies in the queue. And then other projects that I'm working on, writing the rest of the sigil stories, and actually just met with a different editor yesterday, Danny O'Neill at Hammerdog Games, who I wrote the Language of the Birds for his Grand Temple of Jing, and The Grandmother's Tale for his Dread House, a haunted house adventure. But basically, that was the tie-in fiction for role-playing game worlds. And so there's a new project that he's working on. Actually, he's been working on for years, which is his World of Genoa. And so we basically sketched out some plans for both poetry and fiction. But that's sort of the on the horizon after my current deadlines, I'm going to be launching into that project.
Any advice for budding authors or new writers?
The best advice that I would give for writers is that first off, you need button share time for writing, and the second is that there's a certain amount of stuff is don't take bad contracts if you can avoid it, but sometimes you can even give away things for free because your future contracts and editors don't know how much you were paid for the previous ones necessarily, but they work really well for your resume. I was showing Danny yesterday. It's like, okay, I think what you need here is a crown of sonnets. Here's what a crown of sonnets. So I showed a crown of sonnets that I did for Paizo for their World of Galarian. And actually, that for fiction that people want to get, there are several stories on the Paizo website. There's The Secret of the Rose and Glove, which is my first Nora Gantier story, and there's Thieves in Vinegar, which is the third one, and then the second one, oh shoot, more popular one too. Title comes to it is the anyway. Basically, you look up for the Nora Gantier stories, and you'll find them on the Paizo website. But anyway, also I did the 15 Loves of Galarian, which was a crown of sonnets, which was a complicated thing is where you write one master sonnet and then you break it apart to become the beginning and end lines of 14 more sonnets. And these were all of the different iconic characters from the Pathfinder World of Galarian. And so it was fun writing those, and they did it for the Valentine's Day special. But anyway, so I was having to show Danny was like, explain what is the crown of sonnets and how do I write them? Here, take a look at one of your competitors' sites. So, well, hopefully be writing some crowns of sonnets for the world to know it, because it's a very useful and easy way to summarize a long complex subject or a character down to 14 lines, which is sort of the beauty of writing a sonnet. And crowns of sonnets are just sort of a fun, amazing thing to do. The first person I know who actually did one in the modern age, my friend Sean McGuire, who wrote one as a fan thing for Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and with a friend of hers, and like, oh, this is really, really good. So she did a crown of sonnets called The Gift, which is probably floating around the internet somewhere. But back to the advice to writers is that a lot of times you just for the fun of it, do a showpiece, and then you can show future editors that like, here, this is what I did, and you also don't know where who's going to be reading your stuff, but a lot of times it's going to be editors, and they will see something. Actually, one of my interesting credits was I did a sestina, which is a poem, but I wrote it in Old Norse flowing meter, and it's called Advent Windows. And I had Joseph Bottom, who was the editor of First Things, the Catholic Quarterly at the time, like, and buy it for a Christmas piece, and put that there. So I ended up having my poem on the opposite page of Justice Scalia, which was an interesting extra credit to get. But the whole thing that I would say is that what young writers do is the worst thing that anyone can do is say no. And so just go around and keep rattling every doorknob, and you will sometimes find that they will all miraculously open at once. And also sometimes your samples will be picked up in strange ways. Like there was one story that I did with Tom Roach called Head Turner, and that was for the Splatterpunks 2 anthology. But originally, we wrote it both to see if we wanted to write a story together. But there was a horror magazine that said that nothing is too extreme for us. But we decided that we realized that the magazine was really, no amount of blood-covered bimbos with chainsaws was too much for them. So it's like, what would scandalize every, conservative horror fan, but have it be integral to the story? So it came up with the idea of a Philippines vampire, who the type with the pop-top heads that fly on and off, but wanted to be the opposite gender. So went to a San Francisco drag bar and picked up an unhappy wannabe transsexual, which is probably the wrong way to say it, but wrote this in the 80s. But it was a case of like somebody who couldn't afford surgery, and jumped them into the Philippine vampire pop-top head gang, and this is where the whole story of Head Turner came around, which then the editor of Aberrations magazine. So we got a rejection from the magazine that I shall say will be nameless, but just say that they didn't work for him rather than it grossed them out. But then Aberrations had said, it's like, the story is beautiful and disquieting and disgusting all at the same time. We must have it. Besides which, we don't know where else you'd place it. But then Aberrations had some publication stuff, and then I had Paul Salmon, who I sold a story to for his King is Dead, Tales of Elvis Postmortem. That, he asked if I had anything for Splatterpunks too, and I said, well, here, why don't you take a look at this, and if you like it, you can have it. And Paul had grown up, he'd been a military brat and been in the Philippines part of the time, and it's like, oh, I know about these. And so we had that. But then, roundabout of like where you find the extra credits coming from, after that came out, I was at San Diego Comic-Con. I had dropped that off at Verotica, which was Glenn Danzig's, shocking horror and sex.
Like Glenn Danzig, the rock star mother, that guy.
Yes, yeah, Glenn Danzig of the Misfits, who then decided to, put money into horror erotica comic books. And so I dropped it. I was like, do you have anything horror erotica? Why, yes, I do. And so handed that over. And then it turned out that the editor I handed to came and went. The next editor came and went. And then the third editor, she came in, went through the files, and read the story and was like, Glenn, why have we not bought this? I want this for the cover art story for number 12. And then Glenn said, okay. And they got Brian Penaranda, who's, Filipino artist, who knew, it's like, I get to draw one of these for the cover. Yay. And so that worked out, wonderfully, and, got a nice, my first comic book credit and everything. And that also, went around to getting the graphic novels for Wildcard's like, have you done any comics writing? Why, yes. Here's the script that we did for my own short story with Tom Roche, and so we've had that credit. Now I've got a graphic novel coming out, so that's coming. And then roundabout, with the stories of the connections you're making, it was World Fantasy years and years ago, but I had made a phone call to Sage Walker, who was like the newest person in Wildcards after me, and this was in like the very early 90s, and that's the story of how I got into Paul Salmon's anthology, because she said, oh, are you working on anything right now? And I said, well, I'm really wanting to write an Elvis is Stolen by the Elves story. And she said, oh, is that for Paul Salmon's anthology? And I went, no.
You said no. The answer is yes. Tell me more.
Well, yeah, it's like, you're like, what is this anthology? She said, well, you're not supposed to know about it because it's an invitation-only anthology. But I wrote a Elvis and weird, creepy old fangirls story. I'm sort of paraphrasing what saved it, but anyways, that she'd written that and sent it to another major editor for major magazine. I will sort of mumble about who it is, but very, very well known. And she ended up saying, "Is like, no, I can't use this for my magazine, but you should send it to Paul." So Sage goes, "Oh, what's Paul doing?" So I found out about that, and then I got Paul's number from Sage, and then I ended up calling Paul from the payphone at World Fantasy, saying, "Well, I got your number from Sage Walker. Could I send you this?" And he was like, "Going, what? What? How did you find out?" And I finally just talked well enough as like, the worst you can do is say no. I said, "Well, do you have any Elvis is stolen by the elves stories?" And I'm like, "No, I don't." "Okay, I'm not sure." But he liked it. He bought it. It was well received. And it also meant that I was in an anthology with both Harlan Ellison and Joyce Carol Oates, which was a really nice credit to have at 26.
Yeah, that's great. All right. On that note, I think that's some great advice for budding writers. And thank you for appearing on this show, Kevin. I as always, I've known you for a while, so I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So have a great day, my friend.